Hey guys, welcome to another video lecture. In this lecture, we're going to dive a bit deeper into some of the JavaScript functionality that we're bringing into this interactive page. So what I'd like to do is, jump right into it. If we're in, let's get into our stack starter environments, and let's go ahead and edit it. And where we left off in class is we created a p5js sketch and then attach that sketch to a specific division on the page. So we used an ID on a division element, and we called that ID sketch. And then we used that ID not within our CSS as we've been doing in previous classes, but within JavaScript down here, using the window object and using the document within it to get an element by ID to return that actual division. And then when we return it, we've passed it into this p5 function, and we passed in this sketch variable. Now the sketch variable is a function that actually contains two functions within it, and those functions are our core p5js sketches. Now before we dive into some of the details, I want to give you guys kind of a quick overview of JavaScript. We did a lot of the JavaScript core fundamental ideas last semester, but I realize it's been a while, so I'm going to go through some of those core concepts with you today. If we run this page, we should basically see this at this point. I put a little text in here integrating JavaScript and some small explanation text. I think, before we dive into the JavaScript, I'd like to just style this up a little bit more. I don't like how that text is looking over there. It's kind of, butted up right to the edge, and it's really small. So the first thing I'm going to do is, I did go in and in the content area of our layout half, right? We did our grid layout with this. I put a header 5 element, and I put some content within that saying integrating JavaScript. And then right below that, I have a paragraph tag that has some actual content in it. So why don't you go ahead and put in some of that content within this division so that we can see that we actually have some content in here. As I illustrated in last class, you can use other elements like image elements and things like that to be able to bring in your own digital assets like imagery. You can upload images right into this folder, right, by just right-clicking and going Upload Files. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to style this a little bit before we dive into the JavaScript stuff. So we already have, if we look up here, we have our styles.css on the page, and we also have our layout.css. I'm going to go ahead and add this to the styles.css, and I'm just going to go down to the bottom here, and we're going to go ahead and put specific styling just for this section here. So this is going to be the layout half content class, and then within that we're going to have the h5 and the paragraph. So I'm going to go ahead and say dot layout half dot content h5. So we're really getting specific with our selector here, and we're saying just the h5 element that is within a content class that is within a layout half. So you would read this from the inside out when you're reading that type of how specific we're getting. We call that the specificity in CSS. So I'm just going to make this font size a little bit bigger. I'm going to make it say 3EM, or I'll use the REM, so relative M's. And if we look at that, we should see, if we refresh that, we should see that this gets a lot bigger. I'm going to say that the margins on this should be 0, just to kind of make sure that we're butting up like that. Okay, that looks good. And then the paragraph, we'll make the paragraph a little bit bigger. So I'm going to do the same thing with the paragraph. I'm going to say dot layout half dot content p. So we're using two classes and an element here. And then I'm going to say the font size will be 1.5 rem. So it'll be, a little bit bigger than the normal font size, which is usually 16px. And then that should be it, right? Make it a little bit bigger there. Now we just want to put some margin within the division itself, just so it's, the content's just kind of not just all crushed up against the sides. So I'm going to actually go right above this, and this is just kind of, the top-down structure of CSS is important, but I want to be able to read this pretty cleanly. And in this case, it doesn't matter too much, but I'm going to put it right above this layout half, all the other layout half stuff we did. I'm going to say layout half dot content, and we'll say padding 10px. Now this should give us a little bit of padding internally. There we go. So we got a little space there. I like that a lot better. It's a little bit easier to read. I might even give it a little bit more. Give it 20. There we go. That's cool. Now I'm probably going to take out that red background too. Where did we define that? We probably defined that in the layout itself. So I'm going to open up the layout CSS, and I'm just going to get that red out of there, this background color. Cool. There we go. So now we have a nice white background, some black text. It's a little bit bigger, just a little bit better looking site. So I encourage you guys to play around with that and just see if you can get a page that looks like this. Now at this point, let's dive into some of this JavaScript. So we have this p5js sketch now on the page, right? When we explored p5js in the first level of this class, we were doing it directly within the JavaScript itself, and all of the work of attaching it to the actual HTML was already done for us. Now we're integrating everything together, which is really powerful, right? So if we go ahead and look at the actual code here, let's go ahead and go back. I'm going to close our CSS file. And let's go down to our script tag here. So we should have this script tag where we have this sketch, which we have our function, our setup, and our draw. Awesome. So now that we have that in place, let's go over some of the core concepts of JavaScript, right? Instead of just diving into this stuff, let me just give you a quick review, right? We have this idea of variables and functions. These two ideas are really, really important when we talk about programming in general, right? Because now remember, we are talking about a programming language. We're not talking about markup, which is HTML, and we're not talking about a style sheet language like CSS. We're talking about an actual programming language that has all of the core concepts of pretty much all the other programming languages on the planet. In this case, we're talking about JavaScript. So the two core concepts is really a variable and a function. Those two concepts are extremely important to grasp when we're talking about being able to express ourselves creatively through code, right? And when we think about a variable, simply think about a bucket, right? A bucket that we can put stuff in. And that stuff on a computer can be any type of information. It can be a number. It could be a letter. It could be a series of letters, right? We call those strings. And it could be more complex structures of information, like collections of numbers, collections of strings, and also functionality, right? So like functions itself. So a variable, think of it as a bucket, right? So when I say a bucket, I could say, let my variable equals some info, right? In this case, this is a string. And we can comment this line by going // this is a string, right? And this is just a little comment describing what this line of code does. It's always good to comment your code. So this is really a bucket. You can visualize this in your head as an actual bucket that we're putting information in. And in this case, we filled that bucket up with these letters, some info. Now, it doesn't have to be letters. It could be numbers. I could say, put this number in there, right? And now this variable has the number 1 in it. Variables can also contain functions. And that's kind of the second core concept, is this function. Now, a function is basically a way for us to wrap code within a kind of wrapper that we can then reuse and call, right? Think of it like just like a collection of functionality that you can kind of package up, almost like a little package. So you think about this bucket that holds information. Think about a function as like a gift that you can unwrap and unpack at any time. And within it, there's buckets, and there may be other pieces of functionality, like other lines of code that do certain things. So a function is something that really wraps functionality, right? Which is kind of why we call it a function, because it provides or it implements some type of functionality, right? I always go back to, the correlation of the structure of a home and how the studs in the wall are like the HTML, the actual painting and the pictures on the wall is the CSS, and the doors and the windows are the actual functionality, right? And the functionality can get quite complex. If we're talking about a home, think about maybe like the boiler system, or like the heating system within a house, the plumbing within the house. These are all things that provide functionality to the people that live within it. And there's varying degrees of complexity. A door is a pretty simple example, right? There's a doorknob that you can turn, and there's some hinges that allow it to kind of rotate on an axis. But the actual heating system is more complex, right? There's a burner that needs to be able to take inputs like a gas or whatever you're using to heat your home, and then be able to distribute that throughout the entire house. So those two functional concepts within a home are implemented in different ways with various different degrees of complexity. A programming language allows us to basically define very simple ideas like the idea of a door, but then also very complex ideas like a whole heating system in a house. And the creativity comes in with the ability for us to actually express these ideas in code. And the key point is to visualize them in your head. Once you get to the point where you can actually visualize what you want to do, you can express it in code, right? And a lot of times the syntax, especially when you're first starting out, the syntax gets in the way where, I missed a semicolon, or I didn't, uppercase a variable when it should have been uppercased. Those little things get in the way and they frustrate us. But once we get past that point, we can start to express ideas. So that is the idea of a function and a variable. Now they can come together, right? They can come together where we can make a variable equal to a function, right? And this is really powerful. So I can say things like, let my function equal function, right? And then within here, I can have my own functionality, right? And I am spelling that wrong, but that's okay. So I can have my own functionality in here, right? And now this is a variable, but the actual, what's in the bucket is an actual function, right? So instead of just having a string or a number, we actually have a function within the variable. And that's exactly what we're doing right down here, where we say, let sketch equal a function, right? So this sketch variable is equal to a function. And then within that function itself, we define two more functions off of this parameter that we pass in. So we're passing in this parameter. This parameter is given to us by the p5js library, which we brought in all the way up here when we said script, and we brought in this p5js file from the internet. So we're linking in this p5js library, and then we're using it down here within our sketch. And I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of this my variable right here. Okay. So now we have this sketch. Now within it, we have these two functions that we've defined. Now, if you recall from the first series, the first class on this, there are two core functions we need to define in a p5js sketch. That's our setup, which allows us to do things like create our canvas, which is a context for us to actually draw on. And then the draw function, which allows us to actually draw onto the screen. So the draw function is something that actually gets called 30 times a second by default. So the draw function is constantly being called when we're on the page. The setup function is only called once. So the setup function is a good place for us to declare different, setup items, like things like our initial variables and things like our canvas. And then the draw function is a good place to do things like constantly be drawing to the screen, clearing the screen, and updating objects on the screen and things like that. So the last line of this is where we put it all together, where we say, instantiate a new P5 object and give it the actual script that it should execute, which in this case is the variable sketch that contains the functions or the functionality we need, and what element on the page this sketch should be placed within. In this case, we're using vanilla JavaScript here to go out and grab the window to get the element by ID. And when I say vanilla JavaScript, I'm talking about JavaScript functionality that ships with our browser. And you can see that really easily if you go to your inspector, right? If you right-click any place on the page, go to Inspect. Of course, if you're in Chrome, this is what you would do. And then you can go to Console. And here is a JavaScript console. And this JavaScript console is full-blown JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript available to you. So if you type window and hit enter, you'll see this returns something, right? It returns an object, and this object is basically all of the different pieces of functionality that are currently existing on the page right now. So there are a ton of different pieces of information here that we can play around with. Plugins, like your browser plugins would probably inject a lot of things here, and other things that are on the page will also inject things here. There are things like the document, which we use here, right? So this is the document. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in next semester's class, because once we render HTML, the HTML in the browser actually isn't HTML anymore. It's what's called the DOM, or the Document Object Module, which is basically a representation of the hierarchy. Not going to go into that too much now, but the document is basically the ability for us to go and peer into that DOM and manipulate it. You can see here that this will return all of the different elements that are on the page. It's pretty crazy. So this is functionality that is available on the page, right? And we're just going ahead and we're getting that element, or that DOM node, by its ID, and we're going and creating this P5 sketch. So at this point, we should have an actual running sketch. So if we go ahead and run this, you'll see that we are drawing random circles to the screen with this red background. Awesome. So let's go ahead and play with this a little bit and play along with me. At the end of this, I will have a little bit of an extra credit assignment at the end, kind of going along with what other professors are doing with the whole like embedded assignment thing. But play along with me, and we're going to express some of these core ideas. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to work with some variables, I'd like to work with a function, and I'd like to wrap that all within a class, right? And we talked about classes last semester, this idea of a class as a blueprint for us to define and express different ideas and functionality that we can reuse in our code. So let's go ahead and do that. Now the idea here is I want to make I'm going to kind of visualize in my head here a sketch where I'm just going to make circles kind of expand and get bigger after they're created, right? Right now we're randomly drawing circles, but the circles aren't doing anything. What I'd like to do is I'd like to keep track of all of the circles that are on the screen, and we're going to use an array to do that, which is just a list of information. And then in that array, I'm going to then draw each circle, and then every time we draw it, we're going to make it bigger in terms of its radius. So I'm going to call this type of object, this circle that continuously gets bigger, an exploder, something that's exploding, right? It's going to be kind of a naive explosion of just a circle getting bigger, but it's kind of a simplistic version of some type of explosion. So let's go back to our code here. And now within this sketch, right, within these curly brackets, let's describe an exploder. So we're going to start right here. And now what we're going to do is we're going to define a blueprint that describes what this idea of an exploder is. What the heck are you talking about, Professor? And the key point is I'm completely making this up, which is where a lot of the creativity comes into play, especially with this type of programming, this creative programming. We can literally just explore the functionality in the code by making things up and just exploring these ideas. Some of them may work, some of them may not, right? We may actually hit some problems as we work through this together, and that's encouraged. We want to do that because this idea of just experimenting and getting the experience through experimenting, right? Experientiation, or what do they call it? I can't say it. I'm like tripping on my tongue. So what we're going to do is we're going to define an exploder. So let's go ahead and define a new class. So I'm going to type class, and then I'm going to do capital E exploder. Okay? And then I'm going to open curly and close curly. And now this is where we can describe what a single exploder should do. All right? So the first thing we need when we talk about a class is a way to actually build it or construct it. So we're going to go ahead and say constructor, which is a special function within a class that will be called whenever we create the exploder. And I'm going to go ahead and I want to be able to draw the exploder at a specific X and Y coordinate. Remember, when we're talking about this space here, we're talking about really a grid, right? An X and Y coordinate system. So we have the Y coordinate system running from the top of the canvas to the bottom, and then the X coordinate system running from the left to the right, right? So we have this space that allows us to basically place things at X and Y coordinates. That's unlike what we see in HTML, right? This is not really an X and Y coordinate system. This is more of the layout of a page. We follow that normal flow structure of a document. So it's two different worlds coming together here. And that's where it gets challenging, right? We have these different mind frames that we're like, whoa, okay, we have to like shift gears when we're in different areas. And in practice, there's actually a lot of, specialization happening in both avenues, right? We have a lot of folks that concentrate on just the layout and UX. And then there's a lot of folks that concentrate just on the JavaScript and the functionality that needs to be exposed. Just as you would in a house, right? Not the same people that lay the framework of the studs in the house are the same people that would do your heating system, right? So don't get kind of overwhelmed if you're like, Nick, this is crazy. But it's important to understand how kind of everything puts into, kind of lays out and integrates together. So let's go ahead and let's continue to build this constructor. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pass in two parameters to this constructor, X and Y. And now this is going to enable us to declare when we build this idea of an exploder to place it at some certain place on the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and define two internal properties of this exploder class. I'm going to say this.x equals x and this.y equals y. This enables us to store these two variables into the instance of an exploder itself. So now these two variables, even though they look the same as this one, they are not the same. They're basically copying this from the parameter into the instance of a class itself. You can almost think of it like copying it into a new space. Like, for example, if you told me some information and I wrote it down in my notebook and you also had it written down in your notebook, it's the same information, but now we duplicated it in two different places. So we're basically just copying this information into the specific exploder that we're talking about. That's it. That should be it for the actual constructor. That's all we really need. We just want to be able to place the exploder on the screen at some X and Y coordinate. Now, the only other function we need, or what we call method in a class, is the draw method. So I'm going to say draw equals function. And now we have a draw function. Or, you know what we can do? I think we could just do it like this. This would make it more consistent. It's just draw, right? This makes it a little cleaner looking. Same syntax pretty much. Now this draw is going to basically just draw a circle to the screen. So I'm going to say p, because we still need to use this p variable that is within the parent function here. Again, we are talking about this parent-child relationship, but in a slightly different way in JavaScript. So we still need to access the p5js, what we call APIs, within this draw function. So I'm going to say p.fill, and we'll make the fill white, if I could spell white. And then we're going to say p.circle, and we're going to draw the circle at this.x and this.y, and we'll give it some fixed radius for now. We'll say just 10. And that's it. So this should describe what we're thinking about an exploder. Now, it's not actually exploding yet, is it? Right? So we're thinking about this in our heads. We're visualizing this before we actually draw it. And if we draw this now, it's just going to draw a circle at radius 10 at x and y, whatever that x and y is. Let's go ahead and see if we can get this to draw. So I don't want to draw these circles in the draw function here. I'm going to go ahead and remove this. These two lines in the draw function. I'm going to take that out. So now our draw function is empty. Now if we go ahead and refresh this program, it's going to do nothing. It's just going to be a red box. But if we go here in the setup function, and I'm going to say, let's just create an exploder. Let's just create one. So I'm going to say let e equals new exploder. And we're going to put it at some specific point. So I'm going to say 2020. I'm going to give it a specific area we want to draw it, x and y coordinate. Now, at this time, it's not going to do anything, right? We just created it. So now this variable, this bucket, is now filled with all of this data, right? 2 functions and 2 variables. So you can see how variables can store more complex data than just numbers and strings. In this case, we're storing a full-blown object that we just created. And that object has within it properties and methods, which are variables and functions. So in order for this to do anything, we now need to call the function that's within it. And we're going to do that by calling the draw function and using this dot notation to kind of put our hands in that bucket and pull out the functions we need. You can almost think of it as the bucket is now a toolbox, and it has tools within it we can go in and grab. So now we're doing this all within the setup. So right off the bat, we should just see a single circle, a white circle at coordinate 2020. Let's see what happens. Boom, there we go. So now we have one circle at 2020, and we're using this exploder to be able to do that. So now let's just see if we can get it to actually explode. So what we want to do is, in order to make it explode or really get bigger over time, we need to make this 10 a variable number. So instead of fixing it, we need to make it variable. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's create a new property in the exploder called radius. So I'm going to say this dot radius equals 10. So we'll start it at 10. And then I'm going to take this dot radius and I'm going to put it right here. I'm going to say this dot radius. Now, if we refresh this, what do you think it's going to do? The same exact thing, right? We just move that piece of information from the fixed value to some variable. So we just moved it, put it in a bucket, and then said, hey, reference that bucket when we draw this circle. Now what we want to do is, every time we draw, let's go ahead and increase the radius. So right below this, I'm going to say this dot radius plus equals, well, let's increase the radius by, say, 5 every time it draws. So that's a little shorthand for saying this dot radius equals this dot radius plus 5. Same exact thing. We're just kind of shorthanding it so we don't have to type as much. Remember, programmers are lazy. So there's a lot of shorthand things in here for us to do this. So now that we have the radius being increased by 5 every time we draw it, let's go ahead and refresh this. It's not getting bigger. What the heck? So let's go back here. Why do we think it's not getting bigger? Let's draw back into that last semester knowledge that we have, or 2 semesters ago. The setup function is where we're calling draw. But the setup function only gets called once. So e.draw is only going to be called once. We want this to actually be called multiple times. So let's go ahead and try to just simply move this line of code to here and then refresh. Let's see what happens. Nothing happens. Now, if we go and inspect and we look at the console, what? E is not defined. That's strange. What the heck is going on? So let's go back here. Now this is where we talk a little bit about what's called scoping, right? We define this bucket, this variable, within the setup function. That means that this is only defined within the setup function. It's not available to the draw function. It's not scoped to the draw function. It's scoped to the setup function. So in order for us to scope this properly, we need to define the variable outside of this function. In this case, we're kind of making it a global variable within the actual sketch itself. So I'm going to say let e, and that's it. So now e is not defined here yet, but we did say that, hey, we have this variable e that is living outside of any function and should be available within any function. So now if we go ahead and refresh this, boom. Now we have this circle that's getting bigger and bigger over time and just growing, eventually until it's just a white screen. So if we go ahead and refresh that again, there it is. Awesome. So we can keep going with this. We can do things like, hey, maybe draw the exploder at some random point every time. So random 500 and p dot. Gotta spell random right. Random 500. Right, and now every time we refresh the page, P will be, the actual circle will be at a different area of the page, which is cool. And we can also maybe make a list of exploders, right? So instead of making just one, right? Because now here's the power of defining this blueprint. Instead of just making one, we can go ahead and create many of them, right? So we can create many of them through this idea of an array, which is really the last concept that I'd like to express here. So an array, instead of making E just this empty variable that will hold one exploder, let's make it hold a full list. So I'm going to say E equals open bracket, close bracket, and that's going to signify that E is now a list or an array, right? So now instead of doing just new explorer, let's go ahead and create a couple of explorers. So we'll say E sub 0 equals new exploder. And let's just manually do this. Now, normally I would probably put this in a loop, but I'm not going to go into looping just yet because I think I'm throwing way too much JavaScript in this screencast. So I'm just going to go ahead and create 3 entries or 3 exploders. Now we did this 3 times, and now we have 3 exploders. So now here we're doing e.draw. So let's go ahead and call draw on each one of these. So instead of e.draw, we're going to say e sub 0.draw, e sub, let me just copy this, e sub 1.draw, and e sub 2.draw. So now we should have 3 exploders exploding all at the same time. And they're all going to be randomly positioned on the screen. Now, one thing we can do, we can maybe make the, and this is just kind of aesthetically, I want to make it look a little bit better, right? Right now we have the fill as white. What I'd like you to think about, and maybe I'll make this the actual assignment here is how can we make this be a random color every time that we draw the actual exploder? And more importantly, how can we make it so that the color is consistent for the exploder itself? So every time it draws, it shouldn't be a different color, but every exploder should have a specific color that it uses. So we would use similar technique to how we did with the radius, where we defined a variable that is explicit to the instance of the exploder, and then use that variable when we call fill. So think about that for a second, and that will be extra credit for this assignment. I will post two assignments here. One is to actually play along with me in this lecture and get to this point together, and the second is going to be extra credit to be able to draw these exploders with different colors for each one. Extra credit, which is if you really want to explore this, I'd love to see this fade out using an alpha channel. So instead of just using a fixed color here, use an alpha channel so that as it gets bigger, it fades out. That would make it look more like an actual explosion, I think. All right, so play around with this, have some fun. This is really the last topic in this course, and we're going to progress quickly into the next semester where we're going to be getting more and more complex with how we're using JavaScript on the page. We're going to be looking at different JavaScript libraries, different APIs, using different APIs that are available on the internet, like the Twitter API and things like that. So play around with this and have some fun. All right, guys, have a good one.